let's go ahead and jump into the topic of today's Design Corner. So, we're going to be talking about shield facing specifically as it came up as a problem sounds maybe too severe, but as a pain point in Pathfinder for Savage Worlds. So, for just a little bit of brief background for folks that are coming in that don't know about Savage Pathfinder, we are doing basically our version of Pathfinder, of the Pathfinder world, using the Savage Worlds rule set. Which also means that we're doing a bunch of new edges and we're adding in classes and things like that because the world of Golarion and the rule set of Pathfinder are often in many places intertwined. For instance, things like wizards not being able to wear armor without it causing their spells to have a chance of failure, stuff like that. And so we're going through the process right now of making the core rule set. So taking things that you would expect to see in Pathfinder, right? So for instance, you can play a fighter, and that's a class, and it's what's a new category of edges that we have, class edges. And so you can grab a class, and you can pick up a prestige class later using a prestige edge, and we've got updated powers and power modifiers and all these different things, new bestiary, bestiary, I forget which is the actual accurate pronunciation. And so we're compressing all that into a core rule book that will be standalone, so you won't need Suede to play it. It'll include a bunch of the rules from Suede. Not all of them, because plenty of things in Suede are more geared for modern day or futuristic, Napoleonic, maybe, basically the time span that your fantasy games don't really cover. So that stuff's not in there, but everything that you need for a fantasy game, specifically for Pathfinder, is in there. And so there are a bunch of challenges that come along with taking the design essence of Pathfinder and bringing it over to Savage Worlds. Things like, for instance, a popular thing that folks scratch their head at and aren't sure how Savage Worlds would do are dungeon crawls, right? That notion that you're going to be going room by room, and your progress is measured in rooms, and you're going to go through all 32 rooms of this dungeon, and by the end you're going to have had 32 combat encounters and killed everything in the dungeon, got to the end and gotten the loot, right? What does that look like in Savage Worlds? So there's issues like that where that's kind of more of a macro design thing, which for us actually was not that difficult of an issue to solve of how do you do a Savage Worlds dungeon crawl. I think it's basically the same way you do a good dungeon crawl in any setting, which is you start a fight with somebody in the dungeon, and then the rest of the dungeon starts to hear something going on, comes by and investigates or ambushes your players, right? And I think in a D20 game like Pathfinder, that's a really great way to run dungeons. It makes it a lot more dramatic, intense, and also generally I think speeds up the entire process as opposed to going room by room by room. But even so, if that's a good tactic for both ways you're going to run a dungeon in either Pathfinder or Savage Pathfinder, there's still some baked-in assumptions to the design system and the way the encounters were structured and the tempo of the encounters that are based on the system. So, for instance, in a game like Pathfinder, it's an attrition-based system. You've got hit points, and none of your hit points matter until you get to your last hit point, and that last hit point matters the most, right? Basically, until then, you can lose the rest of those hit points and be absolutely fine, not really lose any combat utility, not really have any penalty to your skills. And then when you take out that last hit point, now you're down and you've got a chance of dying. Versus Savage Worlds, where every wound you take is a big deal. So, if we're thinking about that design issue, right, we're going from an attrition system to really I don't even really know what to call it if I were trying to categorize it, because an attrition system is something we see all the time, and it's an easy term to drop in for how games like Pathfinder and D&D and so on work. But it's a more, I don't know if I want to say qualitative or narrative approach. But basically, it's the idea that anybody you fight does have a chance of killing you outright. I think maybe a great example, pulling from a completely unrelated bit of fantasy, is in the Witcher books, which I haven't read, so my knowledge of The Witcher is through osmosis and having played the games and watched the TV show. But I do know in the book that is set before the first Witcher game, Geralt of Rivia gets speared by a peasant with a pitchfork and dies. or it almost dies and is taken to a place so he lives like. Again, I'm not super, but I know somebody stabs him with a pitchfork, and for all intents and purposes, he's dead. Well, if you're playing an attrition-based system, right? If I've got 140 hit points and that peasant does a d6 damage plus maybe 1 if they're a farmer because they're a little stronger than your average person, that's at most 7 damage. 14 if they get a critical. I'm not going to die, right? In Savage Worlds, that can happen. I ace on my attack roll I ace on my fighting die, and that allows me to get a raise on my attack roll. And then I ace a bunch on my damage dice, and so I get a bunch of raises on the damage. And so you take 4 wound cap, and then you roll you roll snake eyes on your soak, and boom, you went from being completely healthy, walking around being able to do anything, to incapacitated, right? And then it's a short hop, skip, and a jump from incapacitated to dead. Well, when you have those two different assumptions of how the system works, then all of your encounters need to be updated and changed. And one of the things that we want to preserve, because it is an essence of Savage Worlds that shouldn't go away, right? We're converting the world and not the rule set. But the places where the rules and the world are the same, we do end up somewhat converting the rules. Well, one of the things that we wanted to preserve, because it's very much a Savage Worlds thing, we think it's an important element of Savage Worlds, is that notion that at no point is any enemy irrelevant. Right? There's always a chance, no matter how small, that they could take out your character in that single hit that they got. It helps ratchet up the tension and the drama, and it also makes it so that the player, when they're going through and they want to get into a fight, there's a moment's pause. Because, again, it might not be super likely. I think I was talking about, I was trying to figure out how I would get the highest parry possible in Savage Pathfinder, and I think at moment, I would have to play a gnome with improved trademark weapon, improved block, a medium to heavy shield, and my trademark weapon would be a rapier. And I think that was everything I needed to do. There might be one or two other edges, and also having a D12 fighting die. And so I think that got me up to something like a 16 parry. Well, at the end of the day, something like that isn't actually that big a deal because I've done literally everything using, I think I was working out with 10 advances. How could I get there with 10 advances? And I'm basically using every single advance to just keep bumping up my parry, which means I'm not really good at anything else in the game. So that's not necessarily a problem. But on a general scale, we want to make sure that our enemies are always dangerous and lethal, and that there's always a chance that somebody's going to show up and stick you with the pitchfork and kill you outright. And also, kind of depending on the scenario, you need different tools to challenge your players, right? Like right now, we are in book 3 of Rise of the Rune Lords, dealing with the ogres at Fort Rannoch. Actually, sorry, we're past the ogres at Fort Rannoch. We've come back to Turtleback Ferry. And one of the things that is generally true about the ogres is they don't have a lot of spellcasters. For the most part. I think there was like 1, maybe 2 spellcasters amongst the ogres. And that's just kind of part of Rise of the Rune Lords. And depending on your party composition, that means it can become very difficult for us to provide the tools that these characters need in order to be really competitive when it comes to all of the powers that can be cast on a character that buffs them up, and then the bad guys don't necessarily have as many tools. So that's something that's kind of been prescient in our mind, or not prescient, pressing on our minds the entire time we've been working on Savage Pathfinder, is that notion of we have to make sure that the tools that the players have don't begin to outclass the enemy's tools in such a way that we do start to slide into that this guy doesn't really have a chance of taking one of us out. So that's kind of the backdrop that is always in our minds whenever we're doing any sort of playtesting or design on Savage Pathfinder is how do we make sure that that doesn't happen? Because if that happens, we've lost what is, I think, a central pillar of what makes a Savage Worlds game a Savage Worlds game. So we're in, and spoilers for Rise of the Runelords Book 3. So if you're a player and you don't want to have this spoiled for you, I would jump out probably for the next 5-10 minutes and then come back, just because I'm going to give you a little bit of context of what prompted this conversation. Because I want you folks to see, I've covered the state of mind that we were basically in when we're doing all the design work, what the specific context that ignited this design discussion was, what the different options were, and then ultimately what was, where's my camera frame? What was the solution that we went with at the very end? So it's kind of 4 parts. So we've covered part 1. We're about to do part 2. If you're playing or going to be playing Rise of the Runelords, go ahead and jump out at for about the next 10 minutes, and then you can jump back in. Oh, actually, you know what? Let me do this. Actually, now that I think about it, I should be able to. All right. So you folks should be able to see the fact that it says spoilers. When we are done with spoilers for this part of Rise of the Runelords, that will disappear. So you can mute until that goes away. And I do see the questions folks are putting in the chat. I just kind of want to get through the context, and then I'll jump in with the questions, because some of your questions are going to be answered by going through this talking about what happened. So we are playing through the Book 3 of Rise of the Runelords, and we are in Fort Rannoch, which was previously the base of operations for the Black Arrows, a company of rangers in this region that are generally speaking protecting the town of Turtleback Ferry and the surrounding environs from all kinds of nasty creatures, including a clan of ogres, and they're kind of half-ogre inbred cousins. So at this point, we have a party comprised of Shane's playing Morgan, the fighter duelist type. Simon is playing Urk. Is it Urk the Magnificent, I think his name is? But he is a rogue that specializes in taunting his opponents. We've got Chris Warner playing Zardwi, which was a wizard, and it took I think most of us up until the point where Chris jokingly explained the name. He said, "Well, it's wizard on its side." I took us some time to realize that it's just Zardwi is just Zard and then of Wizard. He's playing a pretty standard wizard. Clint Black is playing a dwarven. I think it's a dwarf. Might be a halfling. No, I think he's a dwarf. A dwarven barbarian. And I am playing a mystic theurge, because I was testing out those rules. So I was 1/2 cleric, 1/2 wizard. And we're going through the encounter, and Mike Barbeau, who's been doing is the principal designer on the conversion work for Rise of the Runelords, is running the playtest. Because he's the one that made all the changes and updated the encounters and did all that work, so he's the one that needs the feedback. And so we have gone through and we have fought, we using the black arrows to create a distraction, and then going through, actually I think we teleported to the top of the tower. Now I'm thinking about it, we teleported to the top of the tower at the top of Fort Rannoch, and then worked our way down. And so that meant the first fight that we got into inside Fort Rannoch was versus Jagrith Krieg, the chieftain of the Krieg clan. And so we get into a fight with him and a couple. There was a wild card warrior with like a metal lower jaw, a wild card like cleric ogre lady. I don't actually remember off the top of my head what exactly her class was. Maybe she was a druid something, but she was some sort of spellcaster. And then a bunch of extra ogres. And Jagrith Krieg is this big, nasty guy that we're fighting. And previously, like a week before, we were playtesting with a different group composition, a very suboptimal group composition featuring a cleric that if they healed anybody who didn't follow their religion, they would have committed a minor sin and take a -2 on all their spell casting, or for them faith rolls until for the next week. So we basically had a cleric that wouldn't heal, and then so that and a couple of oddities of the way our characters were built, because we just were like, let's just all go and make characters that leverage the prestige classes. We didn't really coordinate or talk about it. When we all came back together, we had some very obvious deficits, and we also split the party going into this level of the tower, and so we TPK'd. And so we're running through this encounter again. Mike has made a bunch of updates to how it's going to play, and then also we have a much more balanced composition, right? Wizard, fighter, rogue, barbarian, and mystic theurge, but I'm more a cleric than I am a wizard. And so we get through that fight. We chop off Jagrith Krieg's head and use that to scare the rest of the ogres. And while Shane's character and Clint's character, the fighter, duelist, and the barbarian are outside scaring off the rest of the ogres. And this was during a day where Chris wasn't able to make it, so our wizard was basically just melded back into the background. Myself and the rogue were checking out the interior of the fort. And so we go down these set of stairs. The rogue opens the door. Something stabs him a couple of times. He's unconscious. I grab him, pull him up the stairs, and heal him. And then we see that this Lamia matriarch, the head of the cult that we are actually here to deal with, she's the reason we're here. We found some letters between her and her sister, another Lamia matriarch, that we killed in Magnamar, and we stopped her cult there, and now we're here to find her and kill her to continue to stop her cult that is trying to sacrifice people's souls to their evil god. Or are they sacrificing to Lamash too? Or maybe their goddess. I forget off the top of my head who they're actually sacrificing to. But again, evil person we want to stop. So she starts coming after us up these stairs. The rogue goes running off to notify the rest of the party. And so I get behind this door and close it. And I'm just waiting, right? Because I'm playing an elderly half-elf, right? He's near the end of his life. He's not fast enough to run away from this Lamia matriarch, so I'm just in one of these rooms with my shield pressed up against the door, holding it closed, waiting for reinforcements to come. And then she teleports behind me into the room and hits me in the back with a bolt. So then I go running out into the room. And so multiple rounds of combat follow as the rest of the group come in. And actually, I think this was split over 2 sessions. So the second session, we had our wizard once more coming in from the gate of the fort, where the barbarian, rogue, and fighter are Lamia matriarch up here, and she has used, is it Mirelf, I think is the name of the modifier. I forget off the top of my head. But basically, she's used summon ally to make a duplicate of herself, and now we're fighting both of them. And I am at this point very low on power points, and I've got a point of fatigue and I think a wound. Oh no, I don't have any wounds. But I'm generally low on spells, and she hits hard, and she really hates me. She knows I'm the healer. She knows that when she deals 3 wounds to or 2 wounds to the rogue, I'm the one that's going to immediately get a raise on my healing roll for my spell healing, not a healing skill roll, and remove those 2 wounds. So she is very much not a big fan of me and is trying to kill me. So I am pressed up against these double doors, just my shield like on my arm, looking through, just watching in case somebody takes a bunch of wounds so I can cast healing. Because one of the things that you get as a cleric, or as a cleric in Savage Pathfinder is you get channel energy, which allows you to use healing at a range of smarts, and also gives you access to the additional recipient's modifier on healing. So I'm basically there trying to make myself as little a target as possible, so she has as much difficulty bolting me through the door. And at this point, she's also invisible, and the fighter has thrown a bowl of basically blood and gore that the ogres made out of somebody in the fort onto her to try and make it easier to see her because she's invisible, which works with some success. And then all of a sudden, the kind of floating bloodstains are no longer there. And she starts attacking me from the back, having done the exact same thing, having teleported behind me, and is now trying to stab me to death. And so this is where, and I think that ends the spoilers. So let me go ahead and turn that off so folks know they can unmute and return to the design discussion. So this is where the conversation begins. Because rules as written, right, at that point, before we've done any revisions or really thought about it or anything like that, I get my shield. There's not a lot of instances in which I don't get my shield bonus to parry, right? It's not hard-coded into the rules. And that's because, generally speaking, it's a very situational thing, and the default kind of answer that we have for those types of things is it should be up to the GM, right? What makes sense to the GM in that situation and with the circumstances surrounding it and makes sense for their group and what they find fun is basically always more important than whatever's in the rule set. You know, even if it's an official rule and you don't like it and you want to change it, you should. It's your game. But a lot of folks aren't comfortable with modifying the rule set, either because they're newer GMs or they want things to be as fair as possible and so they want to follow the rules as much as possible so that their players know what to expect. Or folks just don't even think to just make their own rule calling. It's something we often, I think I say this the most, just because it's at the forefront of my mind a bunch. I'm always saying all the time, let's give the GM permission. If we put it in the book and say, hey, you can do this thing, then the GM knows they can do that thing. Should they intrinsically know that they can do whatever they want and throw out or add any rules that they want? They should. But oftentimes people need the permission. And since we're making we're making a product, right? This isn't some homebrew. We're making an actual product, and so we want to make sure that that permission is in there, right? If you're just homebrewing something, then you kind of that's kind of the difference I find between homebrew and professional work is the professional work takes into account the fact that there are people that aren't going to have your same assumptions into your playing, and so we have to do a little bit more work. And Jack Thread Creeper, I'm just about to get to that. Sounds like a case of character awareness. Reminds me of the drop. We talked about the drop. However, remember, the reason I'm looking through this is to keep an eye on the Lamia Matriarch and see what's going on. And so the fact that that blood stain that was floating there that she was covered in has disappeared, and she's done this to me before, right? And not like, a week ago she teleported behind me and hit me. Literally like less than 2 minutes ago she did this, right? So that's ultimately why we didn't go with it being the drop, and it was just an attack. But again, I'm not shaken. I'm not surprised. I'm not really surprised. So should I get my shield bonus or not? Well, again, this is one of those instances where we would just go with whatever Mike's call was, right? I made the argument for, since the shield is on my arm and I'm doing this, wouldn't my shield be covering a portion of me incidentally, and so I'd be somewhat harder to hit, just because that made logical sense. But Mike was like, I don't think that would be as big a barrier as you think. So let's go ahead and let's just say she's just going to be able to get an attack on you, right? And you're not going to get your shield bonus because she's behind you. But then that prompts the discussion, right? We don't have facing in Savage Worlds. We don't worry about that as far as your shields are concerned. Well, if we're jumping into something like Savage Pathfinder, right, where already I would make the argument that Savage Worlds is a skirmish game, much in the same vein as D&D and Pathfinder. A lot of our rules are geared towards that. We have a lot of rules that aren't skirmish-based, but a big chunk of our rules are all about skirmishes and things like that. And so if we're jumping into a setting that is going to have players be playing in a much more tactile skirmish type way, right? And not even necessarily a Pathfinder player coming over and expecting Savage Worlds to be as skirmish tactical as Pathfinder. But if I'm a Savage Worlds player coming over to play Pathfinder, then I probably expect there to be a little bit more crunchiness with the tactics. And also, if I'm somebody that doesn't know anything about Pathfinder or Savage Worlds, if I'm just a wargamer, for instance, and I've kind of tenuously interested in Savage Worlds and tenuously interested in Pathfinder. Now that it's both in one, I can kill two birds with one stone, whatever the reason might be, right? But basically, the notion is as we grow the audience, there are going to be more folks that are going to bring it up. And so we have an opportunity here to, why don't we figure out what it should look like for some sort of shield-facing-esque thing, right? Not necessarily actually just having, I now have to worry about where my mini is on the map, but something that replicates that. So that way our rules are a little bit more realistic, because that's one of the principles that Shane is a big believer in. For folks that don't know, Shane Hensley is the original creator of Savage Worlds and president of Pinnacle, the company that makes all these books. He's a big believer in the way things work in reality are the way, generally speaking, that they should work in our game, right? That's why a peasant can spear you through with a pitchfork and kill you outright, because that could happen and has happened in the past. So if we're going to make it a little more realistic, that generally speaking means we're going to make it a little more complex. Well, the whole Fast, Furious, Fun tagline, it's not some corporate, marketing wonk. We're just saying that because it sounds nice. It is the ethos of the game, right? If you really wanted to figure out what are the most important things to Savage Worlds, it's Fast, Furious, Fun. It's not some sort of like brand statement thing. It's literally, this is the way we want our game to play, because that's what we would think would be the most entertaining game we could have. Well, so if we just add in facing, well, that means now if you're using minis, that's fine, right? It's super easy when you're using minis, or even if you're using a VTT, right? If you've got tokens, generally speaking, you kind of have a notion of which way is front, and you just look, right? Sometimes it's a little harder on a VTT because often you have like, here's a circle with a character portrait, but the top of the person's head is they're facing, or whatever direction their character is looking in is they're facing, whatever. It's not difficult. But when it comes to the theater of the mind, that is a little more difficult, because that's one more thing I as the GM and as the player have to track in our heads for what kind of direction am I facing. Now, is that big a deal? Is that much extra stress load at the end of the day? Maybe, maybe not. Because generally speaking, I am going to be describing things using theater of the mind as to your relative positioning to all of the other bad guys, because you don't know what that relative positioning is. And that's how I impart that information. That's why we don't have to break out a map and a grid and minis, is I tell you what the relation is. So is the ruling just if you're behind me, I don't get my shield bonus? Is it if you're behind me and to my sides, if you're flanking me? Well, the problem that runs into then is if I want to overcome your shield bonus and it's my turn, right? Because our combat is still turn-based, because doing simultaneous combat is very difficult to do in a tabletop RPG setting. And I would almost argue that I don't know that I've seen anybody do simultaneous combat well that isn't hyper confusing and kind of difficult to wrap your mind around. But since we have turn-based combat, and we're not getting rid of that, certainly not, that means that if I'm here in the middle, and the bad guy is here, and I'm facing this way, right? So I'm facing upward, bad guy's here. Well, it doesn't cost them anything except some squares of movement to go 1, 2, 3, 4, face behind me, and now they're standing behind me, and I'm still facing the other way. So that means that basically anybody who is fighting somebody with a shield, so long as there's not either so many allies along their shoulder line, right, as you would think in like a shield wall, or something to their back, or whatever reason that prevents me from moving around them, if I'm ever fighting them, as often we see, it's two extras on this one player, and they're kind of a little bit further away from the rest of the group, and the group is having their own smaller fights. If it's anything like that, which is a very common scenario to have, your shield is useless. I mean, yeah, we're playing Ring Around the Rosie with you all the time, but at the end of the day, until you get to your turn and you can change your facing, then your shield is basically useless. Well, so then the next logical thought is, if my facing being set on my turn is the problem, but facing does solve the issue of who should I get my parry bonus against, then really the thing that we need to solve is the fact that I can't change my facing when the enemy moves. So the next thing we threw out there as a potential was, what if when an enemy moves within my threat range, right? So either they get there, right? They weren't, and now they are, or they're moving within. I can, as a free action on their turn, change my facing. Well, then you run into the issue of I'm basically just facing the last person that I fought. Now, of course, if I have a bunch of extras going on the same action card, or a bunch of wild cards going on the same action card, or sorry, not a bunch of wild cards, but wild cards and an extra going on the same action card, basically, I do all my movement first, and then that determines who I am getting my shield bonus against, and so half of the NPCs are going to ignore my shield bonus, because, again, we've been playing Ring Around the Rosie. I'm spinning in place, tracking the person that came up and then moved with my threat radius, and then the next person moved with my threat radius, and the next person moved, and so I'm facing person number 3, and I'm potentially blocking 2 opponents, but there's still one behind me, and that's just clunky, and it's more to track, and now it's slowing down the game, which we don't want to have happen. Well, so then somebody else brought up the fact that, generally speaking, our notion of how you overcome a shield, philosophically speaking, has generally been through a gang-up bonus, right? So, for instance, a medium shield right now in Savage Pathfinder gives you a +2 to your parry. Well, to overcome that +2 to parry, you would need 3 enemies attacking that individual character, right? Less if the enemies have formation fighter, more if I've got allies around me, or if I have block. But so 3 people on one to overcome a shield. Well, that does track with real life for the most part, right? I might be able to block the 2 on my left with my shield, but I have to move it out of the position of the person on my right. But in practice, it probably isn't going to work with all of the different things that we now have, right? So, for instance, the parry bonus is at the time of this playtest was fairly substantive. A heavy shield gave you a +3. So that means if I get a +3 bonus, then I need to have 4 enemies attacking in order to get past my shield. And if I have block or improved block, then we're reaching the point where it's impossible for the enemy to get enough of a gang up bonus to overcome it, right? Because let me double check the wording. I've got the PDF open right over here. I don't want to misword it. But if we look at the text of block, right? Scrolling. Your call is important to us. Please wait while we connect you with the next available customer service representative. So block. So any gang up bonus against him is reduced by 1. And then improved block, the gang up bonus against him is reduced by 2. Well, so the way block works, and again, I might be getting this, I might be retelling this slightly wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is the way Clint re-explained it so that I understood it better. Is you have the gang up bonus, right? And that's up to a +4. So no matter how many enemies you have around you that are providing a gang up bonus, it's at most a +4. And also if they have things like formation fighter, that increases the bonus that they provide. Once you figure out what that bonus is, so how many enemy allies are adjacent to me, let me rephrase that. How many of my allies are adjacent to my target? How many of those have formation fighter? And then subtracting from that, how many enemies are adjacent to my target. No matter what that combination is, the max bonus that we can get from that is 4. And then after we figure that out, we drop that down by 1 for block, 2 for improved block. So now that means that it is impossible, if I have a heavy shield, for the enemies to use gang up, which was kind of our previous, this is generally the way we conceptualize somebody overcoming somebody with a shield. It's impossible for us to get a better bonus than is the parry bonus provided by your shield, because we get a +2 at most if you have improved block, and your parry is a +3. So a heavy shield and improved block beats out any number of enemies surrounding you. Of course, then you've got volume of fire, but that's not the issue we're trying to solve for. Well, the easy solution in that case would be to say, well, let's just drop down the parry bonus. And ultimately, just because of the different tools that you have at your disposal and the higher proclivity of magic in Galarian, we ultimately reduced the parry bonus of heavy shields to be a +2, just like their medium shield cousins. And the additional bonus that you get from a heavy shield is when you're counting versus ranged, it gives you a greater cover bonus. So heavy shields don't help you more in melee combat, but they do help you versus ranged opponents, which sounds more or less about right. That fits our expectations and what we think those shields should, generally speaking, be doing. And it also makes it so that we don't have to worry about now we can cancel out the bonus of a shield, even a heavy shield, with gang up if you have improved block, which sounds about right. There was also another thought that was thrown out there that perhaps you only get your shield bonus against half a number of targets as they're attacking you. And the initial issue with that was it was how many foes were attacking you was the number that you got against were the ones that you got your shield against. Well, what if more enemies show up? Right? We've got wild cards and extras working on 2 different action cards. The 2 wild cards show up and they attack me. I get to use my shield, my parry for my shield against one of them, and then 4 more wild cards show up on another action card. So now the math is changing, and now I have to track, okay, I used against this wild card when I could only stop against 1 wild card, but now I can stop 3 attacks against me with my shield, and I got to track that it was this one, and now there's a lot more for me to keep in mind, and we're adding complexity that's going to slow down the game. So we don't necessarily want to do that either. There was another thought that the bonus that your shield provides is the number of enemies you get to use it against, right? So a light shield you could, during that combat turn, maybe we didn't jump into the specific language of this, but it'd probably be something like until the start of your next turn, you choose one enemy to gain your shield, one adjacent enemy to get your shield benefit from. And after you've chosen an enemy, you can't choose a different enemy to gain your shield parry against until the start of your next turn. Probably something like that would be the language. Well, that has that added problem of we are now tracking who am I getting my shield bonus against. And there was also a side conversation of, is that really realistic? Because then that means that theoretically I could be getting my bonus against somebody in front of me and then behind me later. Is that a problem? Well, we recognize that our characters aren't actually static the same way their minis are. So is that okay? Probably, if we don't want to do facing. But ultimately, the solution we landed on was kind of as generally these things are. We landed on a bit of a composite solution. So I'm going to read to you folks what the current rule is as it stands. Shields add to a character's parry. Well, actually, let me move it over here so it's a little easier to read. Shields. Shields add to a character's parry as long as the defender is aware of the attack. Right? So we don't give it's a hard rule, right? If you're aware of the attack. But there's a lot of leeway in there for GMs, right? So Mike's call earlier of I don't get my shield bonus against the Lamia Matriarch because I'm not aware of the attack, that's still accurate. Because I was aware she wasn't there, but I hadn't had the time to realize that she had teleported behind me. Theoretically, she could have teleported anywhere. So it works for that ruling. He could have also said, oh, well, roll a notice check versus her stealth. And if you notice, you realize that she's behind you, right? If I fail, I'm not aware of the attack, same result. I don't get my shield bonus. If I make that notice roll, then I do get my shield bonus. That's kind of, that was actually something Mike had thought, oh, maybe I'll do that. But ultimately, it was like, she's using a spell and doing this and doing that. And I've used a lot of resources for this. I think at a certain point, the thing happens, right? Which is a call I make all the time as a GM, so I completely got it. And I probably in his shoes would have made the exact same call of like, well, she's literally just teleported, and the first thing she's doing is she's stabbed you. I don't know that you have enough reaction time to really grok what's going on. But so both of those scenarios are covered under that, right? So the language, it's a strict ruling. It's so long as you're aware. But by nature of how we've worded it, it is up to the GM to determine whether or not you're aware, which is a of leverage we always, always, always want to. That's something we always want to make sure that the GM has leverage to make their call. Yeah, uh, like Jack the Red Creeper. Notice roll sounds fair, but that's just slapping a brake on the action, right? Mike had already done like 3 things in order for this to happen. It wouldn't be more fun for me to then make a notice roll and then maybe get my shield bonus. That doesn't actually make the game more fun. It just makes it slightly more realistic because there's a chance I would have noticed and spun around, but at that same time, like, that's slowing the game down. Let's just get to the fun part. Light shields add a +1, and medium and large shields add +2. Facing and melee can usually be ignored since a defender can turn to face individual opponents throughout the combat round. If she's attacked by multiple creatures on the same action card, however, the shield protects against half of the attackers. Rounded up, defenders call which one. So we reiterate up there what the bonuses are for shields. Generally speaking, you can ignore facing, right? You can continue to play basically as you have ever, right? Depending on the Savage Worlds game that you're playing, you might have been using shields. Your characters might have been using shields all the time. You never worried about facing. Just continue playing like that, right? We've given you the permission to do that. However, it does become important as we want the system to be more robust and as these issues pop up. That's kind of one of the things that I think is generally true of most RPGs is as people come in and are playing certain types of games, there are problems that they encounter that we haven't yet encountered just because we haven't done, everybody's got a shield and it's all sword and board fantasy all the time, every day, right? But so as people come in and that is their experience, there's issues that they encounter, and so we improve the rule set by addressing those issues. And that's basically been true of every single edition of Savage Worlds. So we've got an opportunity here to do some of that fixing in Savage Pathfinder, and maybe this is a rule change that will eventually make it into a new version of Savage Worlds. However, a decade from now, if we do another rules update. Yeah, and so Boyle Saragar said that's a spend a Benny and you can have your shield bonus situation for me. Right, that's one of the things that made us hesitate about putting any sort of rule on this. Because if that's the way you want to run it at your table, 1,000% I want you to do that. I do not want you to have to say, oh, the way my gut instinct goes and the way I think it would be fun, I can't do because the rules say I can't. And maybe you don't have anybody in your group that is a rules lawyer that is going to go and look it up and say, hey, GM, you're doing it wrong. And maybe that's not an issue. But there are groups that do. And sometimes that's in contention with what the GM wants to do. So we always want to make sure we're trying to make this stuff as friendly to the GM as possible because the GM has the hardest job at the table. But ultimately we kind of landed on the more, we should probably have a proper ruling. Yeah, and Fubeka? I think Fubeka 150, that's how you would pronounce that, said there's a reason I'm playing Swade nowadays instead of GURPS. It's to avoid all the extra combat slowing rules, like which guy I'm defending with my shield, I've already blocked, etc. Right? Yeah, generally speaking, we want to make sure that unless it's important, you don't have to worry about it. In some instances, it will be important, right? Because you, the GM, are trying to overwhelm the person with a shield. And in those instances, we want to give you the tools to do it. Jack the Red Creeper said maybe there's a heightened awareness edge that enemies right behind you that might further send people into the tank build. There might be something like that, one of the prestige edges. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember off the top of my head. Basically, our version of Blind Sense. I don't quite remember off the top of my head. Don't hold me to that. Colin 1012 said, I think the old teleport behind you trick only works once. So teleport surprise, not shield bonus, but do it again and the shield bonus applies. And that was part of the situation, right? She'd already done it to me once, slammed me in the back with a nasty bolt earlier in the day. But the situation's a little bit different, right? I'm focused on I've got my face pressed up against a door. I'm looking at a crack. There's an invisible creature there. Do I notice that the invisible creature has moved? There was some blood splattering on it, but how easy is that to see? Right? So there's all these different things. So that's why, again, we have that bit that's, if they're aware, the GM can figure out by what process do I determine if my player is aware. Do I make them do a notice roll? Do I just logic it out? Do I always assume that they're aware because their character is paranoid or whatever, right? And they're always looking over their shoulders. That might be, if I have a player with a hindrance that they're always looking over their shoulders because they're paranoid, then maybe I would just say, actually, you're just aware of it because invariably you stopped looking at your allies to see which one to heal because you checked over your shoulder to see if that person you think is going to attack you is behind there. So, but again, to kind of get back to what the rule is, if she's attacked by multiple creatures on the same action card, however, the shield protects against half the attackers. Rounded up, defenders call which one. So there are I boil Sargar to give a little more context. The first time she did this to me, when I was all by my lonesome, she bolted me in the back. And at that point, I the player was surprised when Mike described what was happening because she was bashing up against the door and then it stopped. And I was just listening. I was like, oh, did she move on? And then I got blasted in the back. So that was the instance where she used bolt. This other time she was stabbing me with her daggers. But so the thing we wanted to avoid with the I get my shield bonus against X number of people, right? Because that's sufficiently abstracted that we're not worrying about facing, right? We're not saying, oh, but you can only choose these characters and that's another thing to track. But we are recognizing the fact that, like in real life, if there are enough people, you can't use your shield on all of them, right? So it's abstracted enough that it's useful there, and because we're only talking about the same action card, I don't have to track it past what's happening right now. Because as it's written in the rules, which I also realized because, I like a lot of people, never actually read all the rules. I got enough so that I could understand it. I had a friend teach me a bunch of the rules, and then I started running and playing and whatnot. And I've realized all this time I've been running my extras in a way that actually the rules tell you not to. So public service announcement. Your extras move all at the same time. I was always doing it as I would if they were players, right? My players have to move up independently, but they all move simultaneously. PSA, if you've been running it wrong for years, like I have, maybe actually reading the rules is a good idea. But again, it's a tabletop game. Reading all the rules is not something people that will do. Yeah, Colin 1012, the skim will get me. So I learned that I was doing that wrong, which my players in my weekly Saturday night game immediately got on the bad side of, because I now knew that, and we're playtesting Hollow's Last Hope, and they were in a big fight, and that immediately was useful. But so I'm only worrying about this action card, right? I don't have to track this over multiple rounds of combat or multiple actions or anything. The GM moves all of their extras and then does all their actions, right? Generally speaking, the GM can always split it up if they need to, but that means I'm going to know how many folks I'm defending against in this round, and that's it. I don't have to worry about thinking about it later. So that's very useful because we've taken what would be otherwise another basically resource that you have to track over time, and you are only focused about it in the immediate when it's happening. And it matches up to real life. If 4 dudes come rushing up to me, I might be able to block 2 of them with my shield, but as I'm blocking them with my shield, where's my camera frame, my shield, the other 2 are going to start stabbing me with their spears, and I'm not going to have my shield to defend against them. So John Doom, even with a shield bonus, in fact, game bonus kind of exists already to take care of the benefits / parry. You might have missed it because I might have been in the spoiler part, but I don't think it should be. We did talk about that a little bit earlier. So to put it in brief, if you have improved block with at the time the heavy shield parry bonus was +3. The way the rule works, you could only ever get a +2 gang up bonus versus somebody with improved block, and that means that their heavy shield was always a little bit effective. So that's the traditional way we always that Savage Worlds thought of. That's how you overcome a shield bonus, but it doesn't actually work in practice in these scenarios as everything actually comes out in play. So continuing on with the rule, ignore that, right? So here's the caveat, right? We do not want a GM to have a scenario in which it would make sense for otherwise, or for a player, right? If the player is really clever, then we want them to be able to use their bonus. If they're in a shield wall, there's no reason why they don't get their shield bonus against everybody that's in front of them. I've got a buddy to my left and right that also have shields. That's the whole point of the shield wall. So we add in a little bit extra to the rule. Ignore that if the shield bearer has a superior position, such as flanked by allies with no foes behind them, blocking a doorway, corner, or narrow hallway, and so on. If using miniatures, remember that they're static, but the characters in the game world aren't. So here's the other caveat that we've put in. For if you are a clever player, or a clever GM if you're running bad guys with shields, and you do good positioning and so on and so forth, then you don't have to worry about tracking how many people you're going up against. And this is why I really like this rule. This thing that, again, and this isn't final. We haven't sent the books to the printer, so it's still not final, but this is the current thinking with the rule. So if it's different in the print version of the book or the PDFs that you folks get access to on release, then this is not a promise. This is what the final rule is going to be. But this is what I really like about this. If I have already spent the time and the effort and the energy to figure out where to position my character in such a way that I'm going to get optimal use out of my shield, I do not have to then expend energy and effort figuring out which half of the people attacking me I get my shield bonus against. I've already done the work. I've already played tactically smart. I've already made good decisions. I've already thought about the battle and how this is going to play out. I now no longer need to worry about, which of these 4 ogres attacking me hits the hardest? Which of these 4 ogres are most likely to deal damage? Which ones are wielding ogre hooks? So if I do take a wound from them, I have to make a vigor check because of the bleeding. All of those things, I no longer need to worry about that. I've already done my work. I've already done my responsibility as a player. We just move on. I get my parry bonus against everybody. If I haven't, if I think recklessly or foolishly or just run right in, then yes, now it is something that I have to spend some time and effort and energy thinking about. And the other thing I really like is that matches up with our hindrances, right? If I'm playing a cautious character, and I'm doing, because remember, right, role-playing is not just speaking in a funny accent and talking the way your character would talk. It's making actions the way your player would. If I'm doing a really good job of role-playing my cautious, shield-wielding warrior, and so I only ever move into positions where my shield is going to provide me complete coverage, the mechanics are supporting that. If I'm playing a reckless character that doesn't think about how to leverage their shield as effectively and runs into the middle of the group of the enemies, the mechanics reflect that. So the natural way that you're going to play the game reflects what the result of that should be in a way that is not so slowing down for the game that we're jumping into a lot of minutia. And then just to wrap what the rules say, cover subtracts from ranged attacks from the front and shielded side. Attacks from the rear or unprotected side ignore cover. Unless stated otherwise, shields are hardness 10, while worn shields can be used to bash for strength blows d4 damage. So that's just basically a somewhat reiteration of our cover rules. If you're wearing a medium shield and somebody shoots you from the angle that you're protected from, it's a -2. If they shoot you with, and you have a heavy shield, it's a -4. So I feel like that we covered the breadth of the topic. I'm gonna scroll back through chat because there were a couple of questions I wanted to hit on. But if there are any things that you want to know more about the process or why we landed on this or anything like that, go ahead and drop it into the chat. I'm going to scroll back up real quick and hit some of the questions that I was going to hit afterward, just because those folks already asked. I want to make sure that they get some answers. So Abuelo Saragar asked, "Hey Donald, will magic shields improve parry or just have other effects?" Well, I think. Let me scroll down. I think yes is basically the answer. Is yes. I think we both have effects that are going to increase the parry bonus of your shield. I think there's something like that. I might be mistaken that we might just have a toughness boost for armor and not a one for shield. Let's see. We've got a thing that makes the range penalty better for shield. Yeah, deflecting. Increase the shield's parry bonus increased by 1. So you can get a shield of deflecting, and it'll deflect. It'll have an increased parry. But there's also things like energy resistance, arrow deflection, animated, which is pretty cool. Reflecting instead of deflecting. So there's a bunch of other effects you can also get put on your shield. Jack the Red Creeper said, "What about ranged attacks against the ogres throwing stuff like rocks or spears?" Ranged attacks in the situation where we were inside Fort Rannoch was somewhat difficult because of Fort Rannoch being built to human scale and not ogre scale, and so they were running into a bunch of issues with being crammed into these smaller spaces. But at the end of the day, right, a ranged attack doesn't do a whole lot. There's a narrow circumstance in which a ranged attack could really help your melee fighter up front. You could hit and wound, and now it's going to be a little bit easier for you to deal some more damage to your opponent in melee. But by and large, the ogres don't have a whole lot of utilities like spellcasters that allow them to do things like cast smite on their ogre allies, or cast protection, or deflection, or any of the other buffs that basically almost every party is going to have access to, because most parties are going to have 1 to 2 spellcasters, and depending on group size and composition and the type of game you're playing. Abuelo Sargar said, "I've run into the parry issue a bit with my current group. The sword and board fighter is a parry of 12, plus improved first strike, improved counterattack, which makes him incredibly deadly to any extra who dares attack him." Right, so that's part of the concerns we had going in that we wanted to address, is we wanted to make sure that that wasn't too lethal. But, thinking about it, right, depending on your game, the improved first strike, improved counterattack. So first strike, improved first strike, counterattack, improved counterattack. That's 4 edges all spent into being really deadly when an extra comes over to attack me. So there's kind of that you have to figure out, and this is, we have our own kind of internal definition of what we're okay with, right? Like I was talking about earlier, that I think like 16 parry, if I spend basically all of my resources across 10 advances to get up to there, and I choose a gnome specifically just for the mechanical bonus, and I'm just doing a rapier for the mechanical bonus, and just doing a shield for the mechanical bonus, and all I care about is getting my parry as high as possible, which most people aren't going to play the game like that, we're fine with that. At that point, you have spent so much time and energy into doing those things. You've spent all your advances. You suck at anything that isn't a fight, that you can have it, right? And then you're going to have a rough time when, because your smarts and spirit are only a d6 because you were putting everything into agility and whatnot, that you get puppeted, and now you've got a parry 12, improved first strike, improved counterattack fighter attacking his own allies. Right? That was something we saw actually when we fought the other Lamia matriarch in the other book. Was she puppeted the barbarian, and luckily, I think they were parried 1 round and then got free, or they managed to shake it off. But everybody at the table stopped whatever they were. Well, table, right? It's all in a Google Hangout call in Roll20. But everybody involved kind of stopped and was paying attention to what was happening with the barbarian, because if the barbarian got puppeted, we're gonna wipe. We were that close to a TPK anyway. The barbarian actually ended up dying in that fight. So there are a lot of other tools that you have to leverage, right? Ranged attacks, magic, and powers that can help with that. So that's kind of the thing, that if you're running into, I present this situation and my players steamroll it, and I present a similar situation again, my players steamroll it, present different situations. That's the best thing is try to attack it and give them challenges from a different angle, right? Whether it be social, whether it be ranged, whether it be having to fight a whole bunch of spellcasters. And I know sometimes that's difficult based on the campaign and the setting that you're doing, but those are tools that you have to leverage. Scrolling back through. Yeah, Jack the Red Creeper, not to mention that it breaks the idea that all actions are happening more or less simultaneously. That's one fast spinning cleric. Yeah, if I'm always spinning to match the facing of somebody, then I'm just like whipping around and it doesn't really it's not sometimes crazy stuff like that is like that sounds really cool. And so that's not a problem we need to solve for. But when it's like that just sounds silly, then it's we should probably do something different. I'm just looking through. I don't see it. I remember somebody making the comment that you could just break the shield, and uh, I generally agree with that. That's one of those kind of attack it from a different angle, right? But at the same time, that only has so much worth. If my player's invested in that shield, right? Say my player might be invested for the shield from the start because it's a family heirloom. Other times it might be because it's a magic item or this or that. That kind of closes that off because it'd be super lame for everything. Every combat, all I'm trying to do as the GM is break your magic shield. Then it's like, maybe you just should have made it so that they didn't get that magic shield in the first place. But definitely for when it's just like it's just their shield and it's not super important, break the crap out of it because that changes the dynamic of the fight, right? The sword and board fighter was thinking about the fight in one way, and now they don't have a shield. Now they have to think about it in a different way, and that makes fights really memorable. Just looking through, Belio Sargar said, I think I've been using a non-written house rule that your shield can defend against rank +1 of attackers at one time. That way your rank experience plays into it rather than a fixed number. So that was also something that we talked about. And generally speaking, we try and avoid things being dependent on rank in that way, right? Where it evolves over time. Simply because it's another thing to track. And we want to make sure that there's few things to track. But again, like if it comes up enough at your table and it's adding enough value, 1,000% do that. Don't let the fact that we kind of skirt away from that because we think that's too much tracking. If that's the type of stuff that your group likes, do it everywhere, right? If your group falls in love with the fact that their abilities get better as they increase in ranks, do that all the time. Because it's fun for your players. That's more important than any like hesitancy we have because we want to keep the tracking as little as possible. And you're the best arbiter of have I added too many things to track? And I see but it hasn't come up enough to be an issue for you. Yeah. Right. PK Levine saying that basically in GURPS, the GURPS has really well established realistic limits on shield blocks and weapon parries and stuff, but it's the added complexity, and that's the thing we really did not want to have to add in, because the more complexity, the slower the game, and I don't think it's an issue anymore, but at the time we were having this conversation, which was a couple of weeks ago, there was a little bit of a concern that fights were beginning as we progressed throughout Rise of the Runelords to take a little too long. Just because the parry and the toughness and the vigor of everything it was just inflation, right? But we've made some other minor tweaks here and there that have kind of changed the release valves, and I think we've alleviated that pressure. And we're no longer really running into that. Fubuka 150, my character has been using shields because that's the piece that pushes my encumbrance over the point I lose pace. I didn't mention, but heavy shields also subtract 1 from your pace because they're so big and bulky. So that's kind of one of those style things, right? So for instance, the thing I find incredibly tedious, and I've played with many games, with many GMs, and many groups, where tracking encumbrance was something that anybody cared about. I am not one of those GMs, so I'm like, I just don't worry about it. You can carry your stuff, and if we need to explain that you've got a strap on your pack that you release and you drop your pack every time you get into a fight, and that's why you're not, weighed down with all your stuff. But to that end, I would say, I mean, definitely one of the things that you'd be able to do in Savage Pathfinder is, actually, I need to make a note of that because right now, a masterwork piece of equipment, right, not a weapon, uh, decreases the strength requirement for it by one die step, which would, in theory, mean that it's lighter. But I don't know that we call out that it's lighter anywhere. So let me actually. That's a good point. Let me find a sticky note because everything I do is based on sticky notes. Our masterwork items lighter. And it might be at the end of the day, that's not something that we want to. Like, again, it's the complexity thing, right? Do we want to jump in and talk about reducing the weight of things that are masterwork? Are a lot of people using weight very specifically? I don't know. That's something that's going to be, I think, a larger discussion, just because I don't have a good macro pulse on it. But that's kind of one of the initial versions of armor restriction was basically based on your minimum strength requirement. And ultimately we killed that because and this is again, this is a generalization. Your specific mileage might vary, but generally speaking, folks don't pay a whole lot of attention to the minimum strength requirement. And like they might pay attention to it when they make their character, but then they kind of forget about it for the rest of the game. That's not an uncommon thing to see, and it's not that big a deal. So if we make armor restriction based on your minimum strength, well, A, there's a bunch of exploits that allows for by default, and then we're making players focus on a portion of the game that they don't regularly care about. So we've added some complexity to be a little more realistic, but now you're focusing on a system of the game that you don't generally care about. Not a whole lot of great bang for buck. Yeah, Jack Thread Creeper said, I can say I once did an extra versus extra fight, and the spearmen on shields on the front line were absurdly tanky. I mean, that's real. A shield wall, there, it was, there's a reason so many different cultures have used shield walls and have been so incredibly effective with them, right? You're basically moving an almost impenetrable wall of material in front of you. It does make it almost impossible to actually get through somebody, right? That's why things like cavalry and being able to do a cavalry charge through the shield wall and break it apart and split it up into different groups has been so incredibly valuable in the history of warfare, right? One of the things the Mongols did really well is the notion of having your horse riders being able to move around the enemy position and plick at them with arrows, and they can't catch up because they're all these heavy infantry on foot with shields and spears. They can't catch up to your archers, and your archers is whittling away at them. And so they have to constantly be turning their facing, exposing their flank, and then you hit them from the side. So that matches up with the realistic expectations. That's working. Oh, here we go. Abuelo Saragar mentioned, is attacking the shield to destroy an option? Yeah, they absolutely could. It's one of those things where, and this is actually where I find a lot of the value of jumping onto something like the PEG forums or the subreddit or on social media in general and talking to this stuff with other people is we just didn't think of it, right? Absolutely, the ogre should probably be able to. The shield's got a hardness of 10. The ogre's going to be able to do enough damage to punch through the shield. Now, again, in our specific instance, me having a shield wasn't a big issue. It was just, should I get my shield bonus against the Lamia Matriarch prompted the discussion about shield facing. But yeah, they absolutely could go over and rip the shield from your arm or break it apart or whatever. And that is, again, that's going to be one of those, holy crap, this thing just ripped my shield in half. Or it crushed it in, and I don't get my shield, and maybe even I'm distracted because they not only did they break my shield, but they got a raise or two on the damage to break my shield, and now the jagged piece of metal is pushing into my forearm, and I can't get it off because it's warped around my arm, and now I'm distracted because I got this basically dead weight on my left arm that I'm not having to deal with. That's evocative. People are going to remember that. But oftentimes you don't you're looking at a problem from a particular angle and you don't see the solution from the other side. And so that's what I find super valuable about jumping into online communities for things like that. Yeah, Jackthread Creeper, they could have a bonus to breaking stuff like them all. I don't know that we have any like shield breaker special abilities for creatures or uh, edges for players that, and I guess that would technically also be edges for anybody that do that. But that's certainly something that could happen. Again, it's one of those things that like, does it come up enough to be a consistent enough issue for us to try and solve? Yeah, PK Levine, I do think that magic shields have a higher toughness and are harder to break. I just don't. I've not dived. Magic items are not the thing I'm working on. Uh, I did a bunch of the powers work in Savage Pathfinder. I cherish my ignorance on the subject of magic items. Um, not really. It's I just I haven't had need to go in and really read through all the magic item stuff, but I'm almost certain that's in there, and if not, we'll almost certainly add it. Um, yeah, PCs will shrug off wounded over and over again, but once you start destroying their stuff, they have to replace that stuff, and that's not fun. Yeah, Jack the Red Creeper with the heavy shield being less of a straight upgrade and more of a situational one. That was something that we'd also talked about, kind of with the notion. This was back when we were talking about when we hadn't settled on how we were going to reduce parry for shields, if we were just going to do it as we did. But that was one of the things that we were talking about is maybe after a certain point, shields just don't give you a bonus to parry. They give you other situational advantages, right? The reason you want somebody on your team with a tower shield is when you're approaching the front gates of the castle you're trying to bash down, that tower shield is big enough for me and my adjacent ally to get the deflection, or not the deflection, but the cover bonus from ranged attacks. Stuff like that, where you're thinking about it a different way, is super valuable. And I would generally expect you're probably going to see more stuff like that as time goes on, just because as established design gets more comfortable, it becomes easier to identify the things like that we can do that add a lot of utility without a whole lot of complexity, and things like that. I mean, there is a strength requirement on the heavy shields, Abuelo Sargar, but after a certain point, it's a universal. It slows you down, right? Um, so I think with a heavy shield, you need a D10 strength. Let me scroll up to confirm that. It would probably go faster if I just went to the index, but yeah, you need a minimum strength of D10. But after a certain point, hucking around, or not hucking, lugging around a large piece of wood and metal just slows you down. And again, minimum strength is something that I can overcome that, right? Masterwork shield, the requirement goes down. I have the soldier edge, the requirement goes down. But you have to be, is it Bjornoff Harrelson is the guy who played the Mountain in the later seasons of Game of Thrones? I think I'm getting that name right. I, Even that dude, after a certain point, when you make a tower shield that is a tower shield for that guy, he's going to be slowed down by it, even given how strong he is. Well, and Colin, 1020, or sorry, 1012, you don't like the encumbrance rules? Don't use them. I do, like me, just don't use them. If you don't like a rule, uh, then just don't use it. It's not it's not a fun part of the game for me. For some people, it is, right? And I've played in games where that is part of the fun of like, we have to lug this survival gear across the wilderness because surviving and just existing is part of the challenge. Um, well, yeah. So Lilium Lupin said that as a person studying sword and shield, it's two messages, so I can't show it. Shields are tough to break. Um, Not for an ogre. Not for something that is bigger than any human being trying to break any of the shields you're wearing, though, isn't it? That's the kicker, right? And a measly man shield is nothing compared to the ogre shield. A player character breaking an ogre shield, now that's a feat. Ogre breaking a human shield, um, right. So yeah, that's an example of PK Levine. I think to a certain degree, resource management is a part of dungeon fantasy. So I find encumbrance rules helpful in preventing the I scavenge everything the bad guys are carrying to sell in town later issue. That's also very much a group dynamic thing, right? So my players, I never have to worry about that because that's not the type of fantasy that they're engaging with, right? They don't hoard money. Money is generally speaking only significant to them in so much as being able to survive. And I even generally always add in some sort of abstracted lifestyle system so that you don't have to track, okay, we spent 12 copper at the tavern buying dinner, right? So depending on how your players play and what's important to your group, massaging those rules to fit your style is, I think, the most valuable thing. Um, all right. So I think we've caught up through all of the questions that folks had. Um, so next week, which is the 18th, the topic for that design corner will be. I don't have a pithy title for it yet. I will almost certainly have one before the actual stream. But we are going to be talking about how to present mysteries to your and investigations. That's a very important part. Investigations to your players in such a way that not investigators can have fun and progress forward. So, kind of just because that's kind of not a great synopsis, so you know what you're jumping into. Basically, I'm going to talk about a method of running mysteries that I use to make it so that the players are basically always having forward progress and to overcome the issue that we have when we're not writing a mystery or police procedural, which is that as the writers, we get to choose where the investigators go and who they talk to and what clues are valuable and what isn't. We can control how many red herrings they get before they find the real thing. We don't necessarily control what our players are going to do to find information and conduct an investigation, right? That freedom is part of the game. So how do we make it feel like it is one of those police procedurals or a show like Supernatural or some such where there's a mystery and we're trying to solve it without making the players constantly feel like they're butting up against information that doesn't matter and not making progress. And also, how to run investigations for players who are not investigators. Um, there's a lot of training that goes into being a professional investigator, whether a detective or a PI or anything like that, any sort of forensics, right? There's a lot of thought that your average players aren't going to have. And so we are going to talk about how to present those mysteries, how to have your players advance through those mysteries, and pitfalls to worry about when you're doing those mysteries. And we're going to tie that in to supernatural horror like you see in East Texas University. So this week, or this next week, the 18th, and the following Design Corner on the 25th, which coincides with the end of our ETU Study Abroad booster campaign, will both be horror, mystery, ETU themed, so that way you folks have some new resources to use when your students go abroad this coming summer in your ETU games. So until then, I'll see you folks later.